Dark Choices, an Illusions of Mist short story. Christopher, a man in his late teens, had his brown book satchel slung over his shoulder as he was walking home from the library. It was late fall, and despite it being dinner time, the sun was already down. The street was only slightly lit up from the few streetlights. He wore a deep red windbreaker to keep out the colder than usual air, the same cold that was keeping the street empty of people. The night was silent, that is, until Christopher was passing an alley and heard the sounds of a struggle. He stopped and peered down the alleyway. It was made up of a four-story building on one side and a five-story building on the other. It took a few moments for his eyes to adjust to the darkness. He could just make out that there were three white men in their mid-20s, manhandling a black woman. Two of them were holding the woman against the wall while the leader was talking to the woman up close. Christopher's face hardened as he realized what was happening. He quietly put down his satchel and stuck into the alley. He moved silently up to the group, so much so that the leader, who was about to strike the woman, was taken aback as Christopher said, "Let her go." The man slightly jumped and faced Christopher and said laughingly, "Or what?" Christopher narrowed his eyes. "Or I'll make you." The man stopped laughing and pulled out a switchblade. "Get out of here, or I'll—" Before the man could finish what he was saying, Christopher kicked him in the groin, throat punched him, did a wheel kick, and sent the man flying unconscious to the ground. He then turned his attention to the two men holding the woman against the wall. All three of them looked at him with surprise. "Let her go." At Christopher's words, the men came out of the momentary shock. They both shoved the woman against Christopher and ran down the alleyway away from him. Christopher caught the woman and looked down into her eyes, his face softening. "You're safe now." The woman stared into his eyes as her own eyes began to fill with water. She began to cry on his shoulder. After a few moments, they began to walk out of the alley with her leaning on him. Once they were back on the streets, she thanked him, and they parted ways. She walked down the street in the opposite direction he was going. Before continuing home, he bent over to pick up his book satchel. After straightening up, he shivered slightly, and not from the cold. It was the oddest feeling. He looked back down the alleyway, but there was nothing there, not even the man he knocked out. He shrugged, thinking to himself, he must have woken up and walked away, and continued his walk home. Draven looked down into the alleyway from atop a four-story building. In the alleyway, there was a struggle. Three men were attacking a woman. They had her up against the wall. He sighed as he prepared to jump down. "This is really the best I could find tonight," he thought to himself. He was about to jump down as he saw a young man enter the alley. He looked several years younger than the men attacking the woman. Draven thought the young man was moving surprisingly silent towards the attackers, for a human. Draven watched as the man approached them. The man in the red jacket took down one opponent in such a way that Draven was mildly impressed. He was disappointed the young man didn't give the others the same treatment. As the man began to escort the woman out of the alleyway, Draven dropped to the 4 stories as silently as a feather to the alley floor. He reached down and picked up the ruffian by the neck and held him up at eye level and shook his head. Pathetic. He looked down the alleyway as the man in the red jacket was straightening back up from picking up his book satchel. Draven jumped back up to where he had stood on the roof just as smoothly as he had dropped. However, this time he carried the body of the young ruffian in one hand. He watched from above as the other man looked quizzically down the alleyway before continuing down the street. Draven raised an eyebrow. Interesting. Did he sense me? Draven looked back to the body in his hand. He brought it closer, opened his mouth, and sunk his teeth into the young man's neck. He didn't stop drinking till the body was drained of its life-giving essence. He removed his teeth from the lifeless corpse. He slightly bit the inside of his lips. Using the blood on his tongue, he licked the wounds, causing them to heal. He then dropped the body off the side of the building in an attempt to make it look like he had fallen over the edge of the building. Draven then jumped to the next building and looked down the street for the young man. He caught sight of him and jumped from rooftop to roof, following him. Eventually, the young man entered a 3-story townhouse. Draven spent the rest of the evening sitting on the roof and listening into the home. Eventually, the family went to bed. By the end of the evening, he learned the boy was going to the local college and lived with his parents at home. He also learned that the boy's name was Christopher, and he had a large family with several older brothers, all of whom had moved out. Tomorrow he was going to spend the day at school and meet his uncle for lunch between classes. After everybody had gone to bed, Draven sat on the roof a bit longer, thinking. There is something about this Christopher. He intrigues me. Something about the way he fights. Then there is that moment where I was sure he could sense me. Exceedingly rare. Very unexpected. Draven looked over the night scene. The lights were cluttering up the view, the buildings were breaking the wind up in unnatural patterns, and the smell of civilization clung to the air. It was different throughout the centuries, but there was always a familiar scent when it came to civilizations. It had been a long time since he had found any human, even mildly interesting. He nodded as he made up his mind. I'll follow him tomorrow and see how interesting this Christopher person might be. He jumped down off the roof and walked back to his hotel. After all, he had school tomorrow. It was a crisp fall day. The ground was covered in golden brown fallen leaves. Despite the cool air, the sun beamed down, keeping Christopher warm, with the help of his jacket, of course. Christopher was not surprised his uncle would choose to eat on the patio. He set his book satchel down next to his chair and took a seat. It wasn't long before his uncle Oliver joined him at the table. His uncle was older than him, but he wasn't sure by how much. He always thought he looked like he was in his 20s, but he must be in his early 30s. He wasn't his real uncle, of course. He was just a family friend. He was close enough to the family that he was just always Uncle Oliver. His earliest memories of his uncle were in first grade when he started training him in martial arts. As his uncle sat down, Christopher greeted him. Hello, Uncle Oliver. Oliver scooted his chair towards the table as he spoke. Christopher, thanks for joining me for lunch. How was your morning at school? It was okay, Uncle. I'm not a fan of world history, though. I'm not even sure why you insisted on me taking liberal art classes. I don't like book studying. I'm more physical than that. His uncle nodded. You may not like studying, but you're good at it. I understand you don't like it, but it's necessary. Christopher slumped back in his chair and half-heartedly picked up his menu. I know. You and my parents want me to do this, but it doesn't feel right. I would rather pursue my fighting. That's the one thing I do enjoy studying. Oliver sighed. I know, and you're good at fighting, but that's not all there is in the world. It's important to learn about the past, to learn about other cultures. It gives you insight into how other people think and behave. It helps you decide on what kind of a person you would like to become. You're young. You're only 18. You have a whole life ahead of you. This is only your first term. You'll get used to the workload. Christopher put down his menu. It's not the workload, Uncle. I can cope with the extra work. I just sit in class and I don't want to be there. It puts me on edge. My mind is full of developing myself to be the best fighter. I want to get into boxing. I know you don't want me to, but it's something I've always wanted to do. Oliver sighed. I know. But you have time. You're still young. Tell you what. We will continue your training. If after college you still want to try your hand at boxing, you can. Christopher perked up slightly. Are you serious, Uncle? What about my parents? Oliver waved off Christopher's concerns. I'll talk to your parents. They might not be happy, but they will come around. In the meantime, focus on your work. I'll take care of your parents. Just make sure you get good grades. If you don't, I will stop training you. Christopher was a bit surprised. He wanted his uncle to keep training him. He had been training him since the age of 10. He got a serious look on his face and nodded. Of course, Uncle. I'll do my best. The waitress approached the table, smiling. Have you two decided what you'd like? Christopher smiled and looked up at the waitress. Yes, I'd like a turkey club and a glass of orange juice. The waitress wrote down his order and looked over at Oliver. What about you, dear? Oliver looked up at the waitress. I'll take a water and meatloaf with mashed potatoes. She wrote down his order and looked back up. Sounds wonderful. I'll get them to start work on it right away. She put her order book in her apron pocket and walked away. Oliver leaned forward and half whispered to Christopher like he was sharing a secret. I might even consider becoming your coach and managing you too, if you decide to go with boxing after college. Christopher was beaming. For real, Uncle? You would do that? Oliver nodded. Of course, you're my favorite nephew. I don't think you should do it, but if you do, I want to be there to support you and make sure no one takes advantage of you. Christopher began to speak. Thank you, Uncle. I really appreciate... But stopped as Oliver stood up abruptly. Oliver moved his head once from right to left, scanning the courtyard, ignoring Christopher. Christopher looked up at his uncle. Is something wrong, Uncle? Oliver continued his scanning of the crowd. He had a look of concentration on his face, but as quickly as he he changed back. He looked down at his nephew. The stony look on his face changed and the warm smile returned. No, nothing is wrong. It's nothing. I thought I... No, it doesn't matter. He sat back down and changed the topic. Did you hear? There was a murder near your house last night. A man named Frank Owens. No, Uncle, I didn't. His uncle nodded. It was in an alley a few minutes' walk away from your house. Christopher tensed up, thinking back to his fight. Did I punch him in the throat? Was it too hard? Didn't he walk away? He asked his uncle, did they say how he died? Oliver shook his head. No, they didn't say how the man died, just that he was found in the alleyway dead. Christopher shifted slightly in his seat. Uncle, something happened last night. Oliver raised an eyebrow and let Christopher continue. Last night I got into a fight. He paused a moment, thinking that Oliver was going to react. He had always been taught to use his martial arts only in self-defense. To his surprise, Oliver didn't react, and Christopher continued. There were these three men, and they were harassing this woman that looked like they were about to rape her. I couldn't let them do that. I attacked the leader, and he went unconscious, and the other two ran. I left the man in the alley. I thought he got back up and walked away, but it was dark. Maybe he was still there. Christopher paused. Uncle? Did I kill a man? Oliver leaned in and spoke at a near whisper. He had a serious look on his face. I don't know, but I will find out. Don't tell anyone else about this. Just go about like nothing happened. You did the right thing, no matter what. Remember that. He leaned back, the concerned look on his face disappearing. Now, let's not speak of this again. You don't have to worry. Christopher looked at his uncle suspiciously. He didn't understand why his uncle was so calm. If I killed someone, how could he take care of it? I've always trusted my uncle. But if it's true and I killed someone, how can I live with myself? The food arrived. It looked fresh, but for some reason, Christopher no longer had much of an appetite. Draven got up early to make sure he had the right clothing to blend in on campus. Draven tried to dress up like a college youth, but he had admitted to himself that he was not with the times, yet he managed to do a pretty good job. He even went out and bought a book bag and put some books in it to complete the disguise. He had been following Christopher ever since he had left for school. Nothing all that unique happened. He had followed Christopher all morning, including to 2 classes. Draven hadn't gone into the classrooms himself. He sat in the hallway and was able to hear the classroom well enough. The first class they were discussing The Metamorphosis by Kefka. Draven sat on a bench around the corner from the room's front door. He had never had much use for academia, but he did pick up an affinity for books over the years. There was always something new to read. He had heard of Kefka, but was still working on finishing books from the centuries before the man was even born. Still, he found himself skipping ahead in his reading and reading modern books from time to time. He felt it helped him assimilate into cultures better. The second class Draven followed Christopher to was his history course. They were discussing the 30 Years' War in Europe. Based on the details they mentioned, Draven was fairly sure he took part in that conflict. It always amused him to hear about events from a mortal's perspective. In both classes, Draven couldn't see what Christopher was doing, but he never heard him speak. Between classes, Christopher sat in the courtyard and read his history textbook. After his class, Draven followed Christopher to a little cafe near campus. In fact, it was right next to one of the school's courtyards. Christopher took a seat at an empty table. Draven leaned up against a tree that was a good distance away from Christopher. He was in such a spot that he could still easily see and hear him. Draven took out one of the books he was carrying around, a new novel called The Black Cauldron, with intentions to use it as cover to watch Christopher. It wasn't long before the uncle came and sat at the table. Seeing the uncle, Draven's first instinct was to escape. He knew the man. It was Theron, the last person he expected to see. He hadn't seen him in over 300 years, and he wasn't sure he wanted to see him now. Interesting people this boy knows. He fought off his first instinct and continued to watch and listen. Apparently, Theron sees something in this boy. That might explain a few things. Seems the boy doesn't just know how to fight, but also lives for fighting. Their conversation was broken up by the waitress who came and took their order. They then continued talking. Suddenly the uncle stood up and Draven went deadly still. Can he sense me? I've overstayed my welcome. Draven quickly took a step backwards behind the tree and melded into its shadow and disappeared. Draven stepped out of the shadows of his hotel room. I hope he didn't see me. I should never have stayed as long as I did. This is getting interesting. It was a few days later in the evening when Christopher was walking home through a park. He stayed late again, working with a group from his history class. It was boring and tedious, but he was going to do his best. He wanted to make his family proud, and of course, make sure his uncle would follow through with helping him in starting his boxing career. Still, he could not help but feel a sense of guilt and dread over the unknown fate of the man in the alley. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had taken a life. He played the moment over and over in his mind. He could have gone for a less sensitive area than his windpipe. He knew why his uncle always taught him to avoid fighting. You never know what is going to happen. The night air was crisp. The recent rain brought a freshness to the air. The clouds were broken up, and you could periodically see the half moon that hung in the air. Christopher was walking along the path that took him by the bathrooms. He was deep in his own thoughts when two men, the two men who he had last seen in the alley a few days ago, came out from behind the bathrooms. One was holding a stick in his hand, and the other had a chain wrapped around his right hand. They moved on to the path, blocking Christopher. Christopher heard movement behind him and glanced back. Three other men walked from behind the bathroom, surrounding him. One of them carried a bat, another carried a knife, and the third person was wearing brass knuckles on his hand. Christopher looked back as the man with the stick standing in front of him spoke. You killed Frank, or some Negro woman. Christopher casually unslung his book satchel. I didn't kill anyone. I stopped Frank and you from raping that woman. Christopher had never had to fight more than one person before, but he had been practicing for this for nearly half his life. He needed to separate the group more and fight as few of them at one time as possible. He decided he would stop the one in front of him with the stick first, then turn to the man with the chain. If he were lucky, he would be able to break from the pack and run away. If he were too slow, the three behind him would be able to attack him. The man with the stick growled as he spoke. Bullshit, you killed him. The cops wouldn't listen to us, but we know you. The man grunted as the satchel that Christopher was carrying was launched into his chest. The man stumbled backwards. Christopher ran forward, pushing the man back a few steps further. He grabbed the wrist of the man holding the stick, twisted it, and made him drop it. Christopher grabbed the stick in midair as it fell. The man swung with his left hand, but Christopher sidestepped. Christopher then used the stick to hit the man in the stomach, knocking the air out of him. He then punched the man in the jaw with his other hand, and the man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. As Christopher turned to face the man with the chain, he was punched on the side of his face, above his eye, from the hand wrapped in the chain. He took a half step back at the impact. The momentary shock of metal hitting his face quickly passed. He recovered just in time. The man started to take another swing. Christopher used the stick to bash the man's arm and moved in. Christopher grabbed the man, using the stick as leverage, fell backwards and threw the man behind him onto the ground. Christopher quickly followed that up by smashing his fist into the man's head, incapacitating him. Christopher expected that the other three people had taken the time to move in when he was momentarily dazed. He quickly got to his feet and glanced back. He hoped he had enough space between him and the other three so that he could run away. Christopher did not expect to see what he saw. While the adrenaline was still running through his veins, he was shocked out of the fighting urgency he had a moment ago. Standing there over the bodies of three people was one man. He stood just at the edge of the light that was being put out by the street lamp. He was standing perfectly still in a long brown trench coat. As the wind blew, his black hair moved and his trench coat flapped. In the moments that passed, a few red leaves fell off the nearby trees, streaking across the scene. The man broke the silence first. You fight with precision, but there is room for improvement. Your Uncle Oliver has taught you well. Christopher was grateful for the man's help, but he still felt on edge, and it wasn't just adrenaline. The man gave off an aura unlike anyone else. He had met few people who had the presence this man had. Uncle Oliver was one of them. His uncle usually made him feel he was safe, but he sometimes got the impression that he unnerved other people. It wasn't as simple as that, though. There was a visceral quality to the feeling when it came to his uncle and this man. It wasn't just raw charisma. This character had a similar presence, but he didn't feel safe. He felt like he should run. but he held his ground. Thank you for helping me, but how do you know Uncle Oliver, and how do you know he taught me? The man smiled ever so slightly. I've known the man you know as Oliver for a long time. If you want to know how I know it, that's a tale for him to tell. I know he taught you because I could see it in the way that you fought. It's subtle, but I can see his hand in your teaching. Christopher ignored the fact that this person didn't answer his question and moved the conversation on. Thank you for helping me. I wasn't sure I was going to make it out alive. What's your name so I can thank you properly? My name is Draven. Christopher was careful not to let the surprise over the unusual name show on his face. He walked towards Draven and extended his hand. Draven extended his own, and they shook as Christopher spoke. Thank you, Draven. You may have saved my life. Draven's hand was cold to the touch and very rigid. His grasp was very firm. It felt like rock. Despite acting normal, Christopher was very uneasy. He still felt like running. He wanted to get this interaction over with as fast as he could. If there is anything I can do for you, let me know. It is late though, and I should be getting along. Draven smiled, and it made Christopher feel like he's escaping. I'm sure I'll be able to find you if I decide to collect on that debt. Give Oliver my best. Christopher said, of course, and turned around, dropped the stick, and picked up his book satchel. He headed towards home once again. He did his best to maintain a casual walking pace, but as soon as he turned a corner on the trail, he took off running and didn't stop till he got home. The next morning, Christopher jogged the few miles to his uncle's house. His uncle had been out of town for the last few weeks, and he hadn't had a chance to do any martial practice. He walked up the steps to the house and knocked on the door. It opened with Oliver standing on the other side. He smiled. Good morning. Come in. I see you've done your warm-up already. Very good. Christopher walked in, and his uncle closed the door. Good morning, Uncle. Oliver asked, how are your parents? Christopher answered, they are good. They took a trip to the lake for the weekend, though. They won't be back till Sunday. I talked to my brother John the other day, too. That's when Oliver noticed the cut above Christopher's eye and interrupted. Oliver reached out with his hand and lightly outlined the cut above the eye with his finger. What happened here? Christopher lowered his head. Uncle, I got into another fight. Two of the men from the alley confronted me. They also brought three of their friends. I thought they were going to kill me. They said I killed their friend Frank. Oliver gently lifted Christopher's head and looked into his eyes. You didn't kill anyone. I talked to the police. The man Frank died from a broken neck and a cracked skull. It looked like he fell off the building. They were ruling it an accident. The relief in Christopher's eyes was obvious. So I didn't kill him? No, you didn't. Now don't think about it again. Oliver turned and walked down the hall into the dining room and out the back door. Christopher followed. Oliver had a large backyard, even for the outskirts of the city. There was even a second building in the backyard. It was a workshop at one point, but Oliver had it converted into a gym. He continued to the building, but Christopher stopped in the middle of the yard and spoke. Uncle, do you know a man named Draven? Oliver immediately stopped. There was a momentary pause before he turned around. Draven, that sounds familiar. Why do you ask? Christopher hesitated a moment. Well, he helped me in the fight. He took out three of the men behind me. I don't know if I could have survived without him. Oliver raised an eyebrow. What did this person look like? He stood about 5'10" or 5'11". Either he had dark brown hair or black, I couldn't tell. It was too dark. He had green eyes. I didn't see him fight, but he must be a fighter. His grip was as firm as rock, and he did take out three men without breaking a sweat. I don't know why, but he made me feel very uneasy. Took everything he had to not run away. Oliver nodded. Ah, yes, Draven, I know him. I have not seen or heard of him in a long time. Shall we continue? Okay, Uncle. Christopher wanted to ask more, but his uncle obviously didn't want to talk about Draven, and when Oliver didn't want to talk about a subject, he didn't. He learned better than to push when his uncle was like this. If it were important, he would tell him about it. That didn't make it any less annoying to Christopher. Christopher followed Oliver into the gym. It was a large empty space with a clean cement floor. In one corner was a set of weights, and in another a few different punching bags. On the walls were hung various weapons, from swords to spears, even some shields. There were also training weapons, one of which Oliver walked over to and picked up off the rack. It was a rattan stick about 3 feet long. He handed it to Christopher. I want you to do all the basic forms. First, put on the weighted clothes. Christopher took the stick and walked over to the chest at the back of the large room. He opened it, rummaged around, pulled out a shirt, and put it on. It had pockets on the outside where he put in metal weights. He then reached into the chest and put on weighted ankle and wristbands. He picked up the stick and moved back into the middle of the room and took a stance. He was about to begin when his uncle interrupted. And do them as slowly as you can. Make sure every moment is precise. Oliver watched him intently as Christopher worked on his forms. With the added weight, he struggled to do it as slowly as he would have liked. Nearly an hour later, and his forehead was beaded with sweat, but he was done. His muscles were sore. The whole time Oliver walked around him. There were a few moments when he faltered, and Oliver had to correct him. When he was done, Oliver nodded and said, "Good job. Take a break, get some water, and take off the weights. Next, we'll do some sparring and see what you can do." Christopher walked over to the chest, took out the weights from his shirt, and put them away. He then took off the shirt, the ankle and wrist weights, and put all of them into the chest. He went into the house and got a drink of water and came back out to the gym. When he got back out, Oliver had two rattan sticks in his hand and handed Christopher one. "Ready?" Christopher nodded. They started 10 feet apart. There were a few minutes where neither of them moved. Then Christopher shot forward and attacked. Oliver was pushed back, but he effortlessly knocked aside the swings. At one point, Christopher took a more aggressive stance, unbalancing himself, and Oliver took his chance. He sidestepped Christopher and stepped forward so that he was now behind him, hitting Christopher on the back with his stick. Christopher regained his balance and turned back to his uncle. They squared off again, but this time Christopher did his best to hold off advancing, keeping his anticipation in check. This time Oliver moved in, slowly circling around Christopher. Christopher matched Oliver's movements until Oliver made a move to attack. He was testing Christopher's reactions. Eventually, Oliver made a more aggressive move. He stepped into Christopher's circle of influence, knocked aside Christopher's stick, and body bashed him, sending him flying back several feet, nearly making him fall to the ground. Christopher lost patience and moved in to attack his uncle, but his momentum was turned against him and he found himself laying on his back. The sparring continued for the next hour, with a few breaks in between matches. Christopher never once scored a hit on his uncle, but he did get close to landing a grapple. But it was turned against him at the last moment. Today was not the day he would finally beat Oliver. After they were done fighting, Oliver said that was enough for the day. Christopher went into the house and took a quick shower to rinse off the sweat. He met his uncle in the living room. "I called a cab for you. It's been a few weeks since we practiced. Why don't you give those muscles a rest? No need to jog home today." Christopher smiled. "Thanks, uncle. It has been an exhausting day, especially after the night I had." The cab arrived and Christopher got in. He saw his uncle wave him off as he headed home. Oliver watched Christopher drive away in the cab. He went into the house and grabbed his keys, walked over to his car, and got in. He caught up to the cab but kept his distance. When Christopher got home, Oliver parked his car a few blocks away and got out. He positioned himself across from the street in the park. He sat down on a bench where he could monitor the area, but not in direct sight of the house. Still, when he focused, he could hear Christopher moving around inside. Oliver spent the day in the park, keeping his ears on Christopher and his eyes on the surrounding area. He was on the lookout for Draven. He didn't know the man's intentions, but he was too dangerous to allow him to follow Christopher unchecked. Every hour or so, Oliver would get up from the bench and walk around the area, but he made sure he could keep his ears on Christopher. Eventually, he heard Christopher pick up the telephone and talk to one of his friends. They made plans to go to a dance at the college with a group of friends. It was being held in the gym that evening. The whole while, Oliver was extending his senses to his surroundings, trying to tell if there were any vampires in the area. He knew Draven had the ability to block his senses, but he tried anyway. Draven's ability to block it wasn't perfect, and he may slip up, allowing Oliver to pinpoint him. Several hours passed, and night was setting in when Christopher left the house. Oliver made sure to stay out of sight, but continued to follow Christopher. They went through the park and then cut through a few alleys to get to the school. Christopher met up with his friends and they went into the gym together. Oliver stayed out of the gym and sat in a bench out front. He made sure that he was off to the side so if Christopher walked out, he wouldn't immediately see him. There were people milling about out front, socializing, taking a break from the dance. Oliver made sure he could still hear Christopher despite the music. It was more difficult, but he could sporadically hear him talking to his friends. After a time, Oliver stood up and walked around the building, keeping his ears focused on the inside, and his other senses on the surrounding area. He doubted that Draven would go into the dance itself and confront Christopher, but he was ready for that eventuality. At one point, Christopher walked out of the gym to get some air. Oliver made sure to stay in the shadows so he wouldn't be seen. That's when Oliver felt it. That creeping cold, that unnatural feeling, like a solar eclipse blocking out the sun. He was sure Draven was near. It was a unique feeling only Draven invoked. He increased his visual surveillance. It took a moment, but he found him, Draven, off at a distance, leaning against another building and watching Christopher. He was sure that Draven let himself be found. Oliver shot off at a blinding speed, so fast that most people wouldn't be able to see him. One moment he was next to the gym, the next he was standing next to Draven. He was tense, not sure what to expect, but he was ready for whatever may come. To his credit, Draven didn't look surprised. As Oliver appeared next to him, he stopped leaning against the building and stood up straight. He looked over at Oliver. "Hello, Theron. It has been a long time. Are you out hunting tonight? Have you found your prey?" Oliver stood there, guarded, emotionless. "It has been a while. Why are you here?" Draven narrowed his eyes. "You didn't answer my question. Are you hunting? Mortals or immortals?" Oliver decided to put Draven's mind at ease and answer his question. "I don't hunt mortals anymore. As to immortals, I was seeking you out." Draven did not move, but Oliver sensed him tightening up, readying to strike. "So, Theron, you've decided it is my time now? I won't go easy. I may win. You don't even have your sword." Draven nodded to all the people in front of the gem. "Besides, you wouldn't want your precious mortals to get hurt now, would you? If we fought, they would all die." Oliver looked over to the people and then back at Draven. "Have you become so callous over the years? I was looking for you, not to kill you, but to find out your intentions towards Christopher." Draven shrugged ever so slightly. "It's not callousness, it's practicality. If we were to fight, I'd certainly need their blood to defeat you. I hold no ill will towards them. As to Christopher, he intrigues me. I want him." Oliver asked, "You want him? What do you want him for?" Draven stated simply, "I want to make him mine, to turn him." Oliver stood there thinking, Draven wants to sire someone? He hasn't done that since before the Crusades. Why now? Why Christopher? What use is he to Draven? Oliver asked, "Why do you want Christopher?" Draven looked off towards where Christopher was standing with his friends. "He's a fighter, but that's not really why." He looked back at Oliver. "The other day he incapacitated my prey. Right before I fed on him, I swear some part of Christopher deep down sensed that I was there. I haven't seen someone like that in an age. He's special. I want him as mine. He has more potential than most, and I want the challenge of bringing that out of him." Oliver was surprised, but he didn't let it show. Had Christopher really sensed that Draven was near? If so, that would indeed be impressive. He was the seventh son of a seventh son. Perhaps he was too close with Christopher to notice that special gift. Oliver thought Christopher was special too. Not all seventh sons are, though. He took to his training like few people he had trained. The discipline he showed would help make for a more stable and potentially powerful vampire. He hadn't seen someone like that in a long time either. "You can't. He's under my protection. I will be the one to decide if he'll be a vampire, and it will be by my making." Draven's eyes hardened and his body tensed up more. "No, he is mine. Stay out of my way this one time, or I will end you." Oliver looked at Draven, surprised. He even let some of that surprise slip onto his face. In the whole time that Oliver had known him, Draven had never been willing to kill him over a mortal. What had changed? Perhaps there is another way. I too want him as my own. We will let him decide who will turn him. Draven looked over at Christopher. He stared deep in thought before turning back to Oliver. "That may work. I have no desire to kill you, and I know I may well lose. We have fought many battles together, and never once were we on opposite sides. I'm willing to compromise this one time, but he must decide soon." Oliver felt a small sense of relief. He did not want to fight here, out in the open, and especially when it was not on his own terms. Why must it be soon? He is still young, he has much to learn, and I don't want to turn him and make him regret not having had some resemblance of a mortal life. Draven shook his head. He is of the right age. He is a man. You have grown accustomed to the normalcies of this age. He is ready to be turned. I will not wait. Oliver thought for a moment. Maybe he shouldn't push this. Compromise was already tenuous at best. Fine, if he chooses you, I won't stop you from turning him at your choosing. However, when the time comes, I urge you to reconsider and let him live for a while longer before bringing him into our world. A decade or two is nothing for creatures like us. Draven nodded. I will consider it. Oliver let out a mental sigh. That is something, at least. We can meet tomorrow and talk to him. I have no doubt that this will be a shock to him. Draven shook his head ever so slightly. No, I'll talk to him myself. I will not force a choice on him at our next meeting, but the choice must be made soon. At this, he turned and made ready to leave, but he looked back at Oliver. It was agreeable to see you again. I am still yours. I will join the hunt again if we find that it is necessary to kill the others. As you know, I enjoy a challenge. And then he quickly moved off and disappeared into the darkness. Oliver watched as Draven disappeared. He no longer felt Draven's presence. Either he had let his guard down before to lure him in, or it had just slipped. Oliver wasn't sure, but it was too much of a coincidence to have been an accident. He looked over at Christopher, who was walking back into the gym with his friends. He had his answer. He now knew why Draven was following Christopher. He moved out towards his car and began to make his way home. Thank you for listening to the first part of Dark Choices. If you'd like to see the video series where I wrote and edited the story, click on the playlist on the bottom right of your screen.